Malcolm Johnson, a decorated Air Force veteran with 25 years of service, stood over the cowering businessman, his voice carrying through the silent airplane cabin. "Touch that child again, and it won't be the marshals you'll face." Behind him, little Andre clutched his bleeding lip, tears streaming silently down his face. "Where are you watching from today?" Before we dive into this powerful story of courage in the face of injustice, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories that shine a light on the reality many Americans face every day. Your support helps us share these important moments that change lives forever. Andre Williams clutched his small backpack to his chest as he followed the flight attendant down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737. At 8 years old, with wide curious eyes and a bright smile that revealed a missing front tooth, Andre was flying alone for the first time. His mother had pinned a "unaccompanied minor" badge to his blue Atlanta Braves t-shirt, and he wore it proudly like a sheriff's badge. "This is your seat right here, sweetie," the flight attendant named Jasmine said, pointing to a window seat in row 23. Her warm smile helped calm the butterflies in Andre's stomach. "Just pull your seatbelt tight like I showed you at the gate, okay?" Andre nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am." His mother had reminded him to be extra polite when speaking to adults, especially when traveling alone. "I'm going to be up and down the aisle checking on everyone, so if you need anything, just press this button right here." Jasmine demonstrated the call button above his seat. "And remember what we talked about with your special traveler's kit?" Andre patted his backpack. "Snacks, my iPad for movies, headphones, and my dad's present that I'm not supposed to lose." "Perfect." Jasmine gave him a thumbs up. "You're going to be the best passenger on this flight to Atlanta, I can already tell." As Andre settled into his seat, he carefully removed a small model airplane from his backpack. It was a perfectly detailed replica of an F-16 fighter jet that his father had sent him for his birthday last month. Since his parents divorced 2 years ago, Andre only saw his dad during school holidays and summer breaks. This surprise trip was a special treat after his father had been promoted at work. Andre held the model plane reverently, running his fingers over the tiny painted details and the inscription on the bottom, "To my flying ace. Love, Dad." Just holding it made him feel closer to his father, who he hadn't seen in nearly 3 months. The plane was quickly filling up with passengers filing down the aisle. Andre watched them curiously, wondering about their lives and where they might be traveling. He'd always been an observant child, fascinated by people and their stories. His mother called him her "little philosopher," because of all the questions he asked. The peaceful moment was broken when a tall man in an expensive-looking gray suit stopped abruptly at Andre's row. Richard Keller, a 52-year-old executive at a financial services firm, checked his boarding pass twice, his lips tightening into a thin line when he confirmed he would indeed be sitting next to the young black child. "Excuse me," Richard called out to Jasmine, who was helping an elderly passenger a few rows ahead. "Is there any possibility of a seat change? I typically prefer an aisle seat for business trips." His voice was controlled, professional, but his eyes kept darting to Andre with thinly disguised displeasure. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a completely full flight today," Jasmine replied, maintaining her professional smile despite noticing Richard's obvious discomfort with his seating arrangement. "Once boarding is complete, if there are any no-shows, I can see what's available, but for now, please take your assigned seat so we can finish boarding." Richard's jaw tightened as he reluctantly took the middle seat next to Andre. He immediately pressed himself as far away as the narrow airline seat would allow and pulled out his phone, making a point of angling away from the child. Across the aisle, Malcolm Johnson observed the interaction with quiet attention. At 42, the Air Force veteran had seen this kind of behavior countless times before. He watched as Richard made an obvious show of using hand sanitizer after accidentally brushing against Andre's arm. Malcolm's eyes met Andre's briefly, and he gave the boy a reassuring nod. In the row behind them sat Sophia Martinez, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher returning home after visiting her sister. She had noticed the tension as well and leaned forward slightly, ready to engage the child in friendly conversation if needed. As a fifth-grade teacher, she recognized when a child was feeling uncomfortable. Several other passengers around them seemed oblivious to the situation, already plugged into headphones or absorbed in books and devices. A businessman immediately immersed himself in spreadsheets on his laptop, while a college student 2 rows up was already asleep against the window. As the final passengers boarded, Richard pulled out his phone once more and dialed a number, speaking just loudly enough for those immediately around him to hear. "Mark, it's Richard. Listen, I'm going to be late for the Henderson meeting. The airline has completely bungled my seating arrangements, and I'm stuck in economy with," he paused, glancing at Andre. "Well, let's just say it's not the professional environment I require to prepare. Have Sarah push it back an hour." He hung up without waiting for a response. Andre tried to make himself smaller in his seat, eyes fixed on his model airplane. He held on to his father's gift a little tighter as the plane began to push back from the gate, the butterflies in his stomach now feeling more like stones. The plane climbed steadily through the clouds, leaving behind the sprawling cityscape below. Andre pressed his face against the cool window, watching with fascination as buildings transformed into tiny specks. Despite the uncomfortable situation with his seatmate, his excitement about flying couldn't be completely dampened. "Can you not breathe all over the window?" Richard snapped, the first words he had directly addressed to Andre since boarding. "Some of us have to use this plane after you." Andre immediately pulled back. "Sorry, sir," he whispered, his mother's lessons about respect for adults deeply ingrained. He placed his small hands in his lap, careful to stay within the invisible boundaries of his seat. Richard returned to his phone, now scrolling through emails with aggressive swipes of his finger. Every few minutes, he would shift in his seat, making a show of creating more distance between himself and Andre. When the flight attendant passed with the beverage cart, Richard loudly requested a disinfectant wipe before accepting his drink. Across the aisle, Malcolm Johnson continued watching the interaction with growing concern. As a black man who had served 25 years in the Air Force, rising to the rank of Master Sergeant before retiring, he had experienced his fair share of racism both in and out of uniform. Something about the small boy's quiet dignity in the face of such blatant hostility touched a nerve. Andre tried to distract himself by removing his iPad from his backpack, careful not to extend his elbows beyond his armrest. As he did so, his treasured model airplane rested on his lap. The movie he had downloaded wasn't holding his attention. His awareness was consumed by the tension radiating from the man beside him. 30 minutes into the flight, Richard made a phone call to another colleague. "I don't know why they don't have a separate section for these people," he muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "It's like they don't understand that some passengers are trying to conduct business." Andre pretended not to hear, but his small shoulders hunched further. He put away his iPad and focused instead on his model airplane, running his finger along the smooth wings. In the row behind them, Sofia Martinez frowned deeply. As an educator trained to identify signs of distress in children, she could see Andre's growing anxiety. She leaned forward slightly. "That's a really cool airplane," she said kindly to Andre. "Are you a fan of planes?" Before Andre could respond, Richard interjected. "Do you mind? Some of us are trying to work here, not engage in daycare activities." Sophia sat back, startled by the man's rudeness but unwilling to create a scene that might further upset the child. When the beverage service reached their row, Jasmine smiled warmly at Andre. "What would you like to drink, sweetie? We have apple juice, orange juice, or soda." "Apple juice, please," Andre replied softly. "And would you like some pretzels or cookies with that?" Jasmine asked, deliberately giving the child extra attention after noticing the tense dynamics. "Cookies, please." "Thank you, ma'am." Richard rolled his eyes visibly. "Are we running a children's birthday party now? Some of us are trying to work in what's already a challenging environment." He gestured vaguely toward Andre without looking at him. Jasmine's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes cooled considerably. "Sir, all our passengers receive the same service options regardless of age. Now, what can I get for you?" Scotch, neat, Richard replied curtly. And I'd prefer if you didn't serve the child anything that could spill. I have important materials with me. I'll be careful, sir, Andre promised immediately, his voice barely audible. Jasmine placed Andre's juice in the cup holder and handed him a small package of cookies. You're doing great, she whispered to him with a wink before moving on. Andre sipped his juice carefully, hyper-aware of every movement. His mother's words echoed in his mind from their conversation at the airport gate, remember, honey, some people might not be as friendly as others. If anyone makes you feel uncomfortable, just stay quiet and find an adult who works for the airline. Sometimes it's safer that way. At 8 years old, Andre already understood what his mother meant. There had been incidents before, the time a store clerk had followed them through the toy shop, the neighbor who always questioned whether he really lived in their apartment building, the parent who had pulled their child away from him at the playground. His mother had never explicitly said it was because of their skin color, but Andre was perceptive enough to notice the patterns. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing it to dip suddenly. Passengers gasped collectively as the "fasten seatbelt" sign dinged back on. Andre, startled by the sudden movement, jerked his hand, sending a splash of apple juice onto the seat tray. Most of it stayed contained, but a few drops spattered onto Richard's expensive laptop bag resting by his feet. What the? Richard looked down at the droplets on his leather bag. His face flushed with anger. Are you kidding me right now? I'm sorry. Andre immediately grabbed his napkin, reaching toward the bag to clean it. Richard snatched the bag away. Don't touch my property. This is a $3,000 Armani leather briefcase. I didn't mean. Of course you didn't, Richard hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. That's always the excuse, isn't it? No respect for other people's property. Malcolm unbuckled his seatbelt and half rose from his seat across the aisle, sensing the escalating situation. Sophia leaned forward again, her teacher's instincts on high alert. Andre's hands trembled as he clutched his napkin. His eyes welled with tears that he fought desperately to hold back, knowing that crying would only make things worse. Just stay on your side, Richard muttered, using a handkerchief from his pocket to dab at the barely visible spots on his bag. Some people shouldn't be allowed in public spaces without supervision. The words stung Andre deeply. He reached for his model airplane, seeking comfort in the gift from his father. As the plane continued to experience turbulence, he held the small F-16 fighter jet close to his chest, trying to imagine the brave pilots his father had told him about, people who weren't afraid of anything, not even the sky when it got rough. The plane jerked again as it hit another pocket of turbulence. The pilot's calm voice came over the intercom, "Folks, we're experiencing some moderate turbulence as we pass through this weather system. Flight attendants, please take your seats for a few minutes." Andre gripped his armrests, the model airplane now carefully returned to his lap. His stomach lurched with each bounce of the aircraft. Despite his anxiety, he remained fascinated by the experience, his first real turbulence on his first real flight. Richard, meanwhile, had opened his laptop and was typing furiously, muttering under his breath about deadlines and incompetent colleagues. His leather briefcase now rested on his lap, safely away from Andre's apple juice. When the plane dropped suddenly and then stabilized, Andre's partially full cup of juice jumped in its holder. Most of it splashed upward and then back into the cup, but a small amount, no more than a teaspoon, speckled the edge of Richard's open briefcase. The change in Richard was instantaneous and terrifying. His face contorted with rage as he stared at the tiny droplets on his expensive leather. "You little," he caught himself before completing the slur, but his eyes burned with fury. "Did you do that on purpose?" Andre's eyes widened with fear. "No, sir. The plane." "I've had enough of this," Richard snarled. "I've been nothing but patient with your lack of manners and personal space, and this is how you repay basic civility." Andre frantically reached for napkins from his tray. "I can help clean it. Don't you dare touch my things with your dirty hands." The words hung in the air, their implication unmistakable. Several nearby passengers turned to look, uncomfortable awareness spreading through the cabin. "I'm sorry," Andre whispered, his voice trembling. The plane bumped in. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, witnesses would have slightly different accounts. Richard's hand shot out in a sudden movement. Whether he intended to push Andre's hands away or deliberately strike him was unclear, but the result was the same. His open palm connected forcefully with Andre's face, the impact snapping the child's head back against the window. The sound of the slap cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Andre's lip split against his teeth. A small trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth as his eyes widened in shock and pain. The model airplane tumbled from his lap, one wing snapping off as it hit the floor. For one horrifying moment, the entire section of the plane fell completely silent. Andre didn't cry out or scream. He simply touched his bleeding lip with trembling fingers, his eyes enormous with disbelief that an adult had actually hit him. "Keep your filthy juice to yourself," Richard hissed, seemingly unaware or uncaring of the shocked stares now directed his way. The tears that Andre had been fighting finally spilled over, running silently down his cheeks as he pressed himself against the window, trying to become as small as possible. A drop of blood fell from his lip onto his Atlanta Braves t-shirt, creating a small red stain. "Oh my God," someone whispered from behind them. Jasmine, who had been making her way back to her jump seat, froze in the aisle, her professional composure momentarily shattered by what she had just witnessed. "Did he just hit that child?" a woman's voice came from 2 rows back. Richard, suddenly aware of the attention, straightened his tie and addressed the staring passengers. "The boy damaged my property after repeated warnings. I simply defended myself." Andre reached down with a shaking hand toward his broken model airplane, a sob catching in his throat as he saw the damaged wing. This precious gift from his father, the one he had promised to keep safe, now lay broken, just like his sense of security and dignity. Blood continued to trickle from his split lip as he curled into himself, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation and fear that washed over him in waves. Around them, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. Several passengers had phones out, recording the aftermath. Others sat frozen in shock, unwilling to get involved. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances, their discomfort at witnessing such a blatant act of aggression against a child warring with their reluctance to insert themselves into a volatile situation. Richard, either oblivious to or unconcerned with the rising tension around him, returned to dabbing at his briefcase with tissues, muttering about parents who don't teach their children proper behavior. Andre closed his eyes tightly, wishing he could disappear. All the warnings his mother had given him about being careful around certain people, about staying quiet and not drawing attention to himself, flooded his mind. Yet despite following all those rules, here he was, hurt, humiliated, and utterly alone at 30,000 feet. His small body trembled as he tasted the metallic tang of blood on his lip. The cabin light seemed too bright, the air too thin. In this moment of crisis, Andre thought of his father, who always told him to be brave. But how could he be brave now, when all he wanted was to run away and hide? The broken model airplane at his feet seemed to symbolize everything that had just shattered inside him, his excitement about the journey, his sense of safety, and the childhood innocence that allowed him to believe that adults would protect rather than harm him. The "Fasten Seatbelt" sign remained illuminated, its steady glow a reminder of aviation protocol that suddenly seemed trivial in the face of what had just transpired. Malcolm Johnson had seen enough. With deliberate movements that spoke of both military precision and barely contained fury, he unbuckled his seatbelt and rose to his full 6'2" height. "Sir," the flight attendant called out automatically, "the seatbelt sign is still." But Malcolm was already moving, stepping into the aisle with the confident bearing of a man who had faced far worse dangers than airline regulations. His eyes never left Richard as he positioned himself strategically between the businessman and Andre. "Touch that child again," Malcolm's voice carried through the now silent cabin, "and it won't be the marshals you'll face." The words were delivered with such quiet intensity that they seemed to vibrate in the recycled airplane air. Malcolm stood with his feet planted firmly, his military training evident in his stance, balanced, ready, controlled. Richard's initial shock quickly morphed into indignation. "This is none of your business. Return to your seat immediately." Malcolm didn't move. Instead, he turned slightly toward Andre, whose small frame remained pressed against the window, blood still trickling from his lip. "You okay, little man?" Malcolm asked, his voice gentling considerably. Andre couldn't speak. He managed a tiny nod, though his eyes revealed the truth: he was far from okay. Malcolm turned back to Richard, his expression hardening once more. "Master Sergeant Malcolm Johnson, United States Air Force, retired after 25 years of service. I've defended this country against actual threats. You, sir, are not one of them. But what you just did." He gestured toward Andre. "That was assault on a minor. Possibly a hate crime, given what witnesses heard you say." Richard's face flushed with anger. "How dare you accuse me? The boy damaged my property. I have every right to hit an 8-year-old child." Sofia Martinez stood up from the row behind, her teacher's voice cutting through Richard's justifications. "I'm a mandated reporter, sir. By law, I'm required to report any suspected child abuse I witness. What you just did meets that definition." Richard looked around, clearly expecting support from fellow passengers. Instead, he found a sea of disapproving faces and several phones recording the confrontation. He deliberately spilled his drink on my $3,000 briefcase. Richard insisted, voice rising. "Anyone would have reacted the same way." "Actually, no," came a voice from across the aisle, where an elderly white woman fixed Richard with a withering glare. "My husband is a CEO, and in 40 years of business travel, he's never once struck a child. There's no excuse." What started as one voice quickly became many, as passengers throughout the cabin began voicing their support for Andre. The community forming around the injured child was spontaneous and resolute. "I've got the whole thing on video," called out a college student from the row ahead, holding up his phone. Malcolm maintained his position, his back to Andre in a protective stance. With the gentle tone he reserved for his own nieces and nephews, he spoke over his shoulder, "Andre, I'm going to sit next to you for now, if that's okay. Nobody's going to hurt you again." Andre looked up with tear-filled eyes, confusion evident in his expression, confusion that this stranger knew his name until he remembered his unaccompanied minor badge was still pinned to his shirt. Jasmine had returned with the lead flight attendant, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who assessed the situation quickly. "Sir," she addressed Richard, "I need you to come with me to a different seat immediately." "I will do no such thing," Richard replied, straightening his suit jacket. "This man is harassing me, and I demand that he return to his seat. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the airline and pursuing legal action." "Oh, there will definitely be legal action," Malcolm replied evenly. "Just not the kind you're thinking of." For those watching this story unfold, what would you have done in Malcolm's position? Would you have stood up to protect Andre, or would fear of confrontation have held you back? Comment number 1 if you believe Malcolm did the right thing standing up against injustice, even if it meant breaking airline rules. Hit like if you admire his courage, and subscribe to see more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to stay silent. But this story doesn't end here. What do you think happens when an entire plane full of strangers becomes an unexpected community of protection around one hurt child? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, its professional calm a stark contrast to the tension filling the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an incident on board, we will be diverting to Charlotte Douglas International Airport. We should be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." A collective groan rose from passengers whose connections and schedules would now be disrupted. But something unexpected happened next. Rather than directing their frustration at Andre, the catalyst for the diversion, passengers throughout the cabin began openly glaring at Richard. "Way to go, tough guy," muttered a businessman across the aisle. "Hitting kids make you feel big? The lead flight attendant had successfully relocated Richard to an empty flight attendant jump seat near the rear galley, where he sat rigidly, still insisting on his victimhood to anyone who would listen. Few did. Malcolm now occupied the middle seat next to Andre, creating a physical barrier between the boy and the aisle. With gentle hands that had once maintained fighter jets, he picked up the broken model airplane from the floor. F-16 Fighting Falcon, Malcolm identified, examining the broken wing. "Your dad give you this?" Andre nodded, wiping away tears with the back of his hand. "I promised I wouldn't break it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My dad's gonna be mad." "No, he won't," Malcolm assured him. "Not at you." "And this?" He held up the model. "This can be fixed. I used to work on the real ones." Andre's eyes widened slightly. "Really? You fixed real airplanes?" 25 years in the Air Force, Malcolm confirmed. "And I'm telling you, everything that breaks can be fixed. Some things just need a little more time and care." From the row behind, Sophia leaned forward, offering Andre a packet of tissues from her purse. "For your lip, sweetheart. Hold it there gently, don't press too hard." Andre took the tissues with a mumbled, "Thank you," pressing one carefully to his still bleeding lip. "I'm a teacher," Sophia told him with a warm smile. "5th grade. About 3 years older than you, I'm guessing." "I'm in 3rd, Andre replied softly. "I thought so. You know, I have a nephew just your age. He loves planes too." To everyone's surprise, the elderly white woman who had spoken up earlier moved across the aisle to the empty seat next to Sophia, directly behind Andre. "My grandson collects model airplanes," she said, leaning forward to address Andre. "He's 12 now, but he started when he was about your age. I'm Margaret, by the way." Andre turned slightly in his seat to look at her, still holding the tissue to his lip. "Does he have an F-16 like mine?" "He does," Margaret confirmed. "An AB-52 and an Apache helicopter. When my husband was in the Navy, he flew helicopters." Around them, more passengers began to engage, the shared outrage at Richard's behavior creating an unusual sense of community among strangers. A teenage girl from 2 rows ahead passed back a chocolate bar from her backpack. "My mom always gives me chocolate when I'm having a bad day," she explained with a shy smile as Jasmine delivered the treat to Andre. A young man wearing a Georgia Tech sweatshirt approached from further up the cabin. "Hey little dude, I recorded what happened. Just wanted you to know your dad will be able to see everything, so don't worry about anyone not believing you, okay?" Jasmine returned with a first aid kit, kneeling in the aisle beside Andre's seat. With gloved hands, she gently cleaned his split lip, her movements professional yet maternal. "You're being so brave," she told him as she worked. "Much braver than some adults on this plane." Andre winced slightly at the antiseptic wipe but remained still. "My mom says I'm brave like my dad." "Your mom is right," Malcolm confirmed. He held out his hand to Andre. "I'm Malcolm, by the way. Malcolm Johnson." Andre hesitantly shook the offered hand, the formal adult gesture seeming to comfort him slightly. "Andre Williams." "Well, Andre Williams, I want you to know something important," Malcolm said, his voice serious. "What happened wasn't your fault. Not one bit of it." Andre looked down at his hands. "But I spilled my juice on his bag." "The plane hit turbulence," Sophia pointed out from behind. "That's not your fault. And even if you had spilled it on purpose," Malcolm added, "which you didn't, no adult ever has the right to hit a child. Ever." More passengers were exchanging contact information, promising to email their video footage to Andre's father. A corporate-looking woman in a tailored suit approached from business class, having heard about the incident. "I'm an attorney," she explained, handing Malcolm her business card. "Personal injury and civil rights. Have his parents call me. Pro bono." She glanced toward the back of the plane where Richard sat isolated. People like that need consequences. The pilot announced their final approach to Charlotte, and passengers reluctantly returned to their seats, many making detours to offer Andre brief words of encouragement or small tokens of support, a pack of gum, a booklet of puzzles, a stress ball shaped like a globe. Andre sat quietly through it all, the broken model airplane cradled carefully in his hands. The physical pain of his split lip was subsiding, but the emotional wounds remained raw. Still, something was shifting inside him. The spontaneous kindness of strangers was a balm he hadn't expected, creating a fragile sense of safety where moments before there had been only fear and shame. Malcolm noticed the change. "You know what they taught us in the military?" he asked conversationally as they buckled in for landing. Andre looked up, curious despite his trauma. "What?" "That the most important weapon isn't a gun or a plane," Malcolm told him. "It's the person next to you. Your community. The people who have your back when things get rough." Andre considered this, looking around at the faces of those who had spoken up for him, defended him, comforted him. Then he looked back down at his broken model airplane. "Can you really fix it?" he asked Malcolm, his first unprompted question since the incident. Malcolm nodded solemnly. "Some superglue and steady hands are all it takes. Good as new." "I wish." Andre started, then stopped himself. "Wish what, buddy?" Andre's voice was barely audible. "I wish everything could be fixed that easy." Malcolm's expression softened with understanding. "Some things take more than superglue. But they can still be fixed. I promise you that." The plane descended through the clouds toward Charlotte, carrying a cabin full of strangers who were no longer quite so strange to each other, bound together by a collective act of decency in the face of cruelty. The plane touched down in Charlotte with a gentle bump, taxiing toward the gate with unusual speed. The captain's voice came over the intercom once more, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Charlotte Douglas International Airport. Local time is 2:17 p.m. Once we reach the gate, we must ask that all passengers remain seated until further instructions. We appreciate your cooperation." A current of hushed conversation ran through the cabin. Most passengers had experienced diversions before, weather issues, medical emergencies, but few had witnessed an assault on a child at 30,000 feet. Andre sat quietly beside Malcolm, the bleeding from his lip finally stopped, though significant swelling had begun. The physical evidence of what happened would be unmistakable to his waiting father. This realization seemed to weigh on Andre, his earlier moment of resilience giving way to renewed anxiety. "My dad's gonna be so mad," he whispered to Malcolm. "At you?" Malcolm clarified. Andre nodded miserably. "He always says William's men are tough. That we don't cry or let people push us around." Malcolm considered this carefully before responding. "You know, I had a sergeant like that when I first joined up. Old school guy who thought showing any emotion was weakness." He paused, making sure Andre was listening. "Lost half his unit in Desert Storm because nobody wanted to tell him when they were struggling. Being tough isn't about not feeling fear or pain, Andre. It's about what you do despite those feelings." Before Andre could respond, the aircraft door opened, and 2 airport police officers boarded, followed by a man in a dark suit who identified himself as an air marshal. The lead flight attendant directed them immediately to Richard, who was already on his feet, straightening his tie and adopting an expression of professional indignation. "Officers, I'd like to file charges against this man," Richard announced loudly, pointing toward Malcolm as the police approached. "He threatened me and created a disturbance that endangered this flight." The air marshal's expression remained impassive. "Sir, we've received reports of an assault on a minor passenger." "Multiple reports." Richard's confidence faltered momentarily before he recovered. "That's absurd. The boy damaged my property. I merely defended myself." From across the cabin, voices rose in contradiction. "He hit that child hard enough to draw blood. I've got the whole thing on video. He was making racist comments before it even happened." The college student who had been recording stood up, phone in hand. "Officers, I have clear footage of the assault and the events leading up to it. I'm happy to provide it as evidence." He wasn't alone. At least a dozen passengers now held up their phones, offering video documentation. The officers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this level of collaborative evidence gathering. "Sir," the air marshal addressed Richard, "please gather your belongings. You'll be deplaning first for questioning." Richard's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. Do you have any idea who I am? I'm a senior vice president at Parker Financial Group. I have connections at the highest levels of—" "Sir," the officer interrupted firmly, "you can either walk off this aircraft under your own power, or you can be escorted off in restraints. Your choice." The cabin fell silent as Richard gathered his briefcase and laptop, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. As he was led past Andre's row, he glared down at the child with undisguised contempt. "This isn't over," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Malcolm shifted slightly, a subtle reminder of his protective presence. The officers guided Richard toward the exit, one of them pausing briefly beside Andre. "Hey there, buddy," the officer said, crouching down to eye level. "We're going to need to talk to you too, but don't worry, you're not in any trouble. Is there someone meeting you in Atlanta?" "My dad," Andre replied softly. "David Williams. We'll make sure he's contacted right away," the officer assured him with a gentle smile. As Richard was escorted off the plane, the lead flight attendant addressed the remaining passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience during this situation. The flight to Atlanta will resume once we've completed the necessary procedures here in Charlotte. Those with tight connections in Atlanta will be rebooked as needed." Jasmine approached Andre's row with a phone in hand. "Andre? Your dad is on the phone. He's been notified about the diversion and what happened." Andre's eyes widened with fear. He looked to Malcolm, who gave him an encouraging nod before accepting the phone with trembling hands. "Dad?" Andre's voice was barely audible. From where he sat, Malcolm could hear the deep, urgent voice on the other end of the line, the volume raised by obvious concern. "Andre? Son, are you okay? They said someone hit you. What happened?" Andre's composure finally broke completely. The tears he'd been fighting streamed down his face as he choked out his response. "I'm sorry, Dad. The plane bumped, and I spilled juice, and my airplane broke, and I tried to be brave but—" The voice on the other end of the line softened immediately. "Andre, listen to me. None of this is your fault. Not one bit of it. I'm already in the car heading to Charlotte. I'll be there in 2 hours. The airline is sending someone to stay with you until I arrive." "I'm scared," Andre admitted in a whisper. "That's okay, son," his father replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. It just means something scary happened. I love you more than anything, you hear me?" "Yes, sir," Andre whispered. "I'm going to talk to the police and the airline now, but I'll see you very soon. Stay with the flight attendants, okay?" "Okay." As Andre handed the phone back to Jasmine, Malcolm could see the relief in his expression. The fear of disappointing his father had been even greater than the fear of Richard's violence. One by one, passengers began to deplane in Charlotte. Many paused beside Andre's seat with words of encouragement or small gifts, a business card, a pack of gum, a comic book from a teenager's backpack. Each gesture reinforced the spontaneous community that had formed around the injured child. An airline representative boarded as the last passengers were leaving, identifying herself as customer service director for the airline's Charlotte operations. "Andre? I'm Ms. Patel," she said gently. "I'll be staying with you until your father arrives. We've arranged a private room in our club lounge where you can rest and have something to eat." She turned to Malcolm, extending her hand. "Sir, on behalf of the airline, thank you for intervening in this situation. We have zero tolerance for any form of assault or discrimination on our aircraft. Malcolm shook her hand firmly. Just did what needed doing, ma'am. As Andre prepared to leave with Ms. Patel, he turned to Malcolm with unexpected determination in his young face. Will you come too? Until my dad gets here. Malcolm glanced at Ms. Patel, who nodded her approval. Of course I will, little man. Lead the way. Together, they walked off the plane, Andre still clutching his broken model airplane, its damaged wing a reminder of what had been broken, and what could still be repaired. 3 hours later, the rescheduled flight to Atlanta prepared for boarding. Most of the original passengers had gathered at the gate again, many exchanging smiles of recognition, their shared experience having created an unusual bond. The incident had transformed strangers into something more than acquaintances but not quite friends, witnesses to the same pivotal moment, united by their collective response. Malcolm sat in the waiting area, his carry-on bag beside him. He had spent the past 2 hours in the airline's premium lounge with Andre, the boy's initial shock gradually giving way to moments of childlike resilience. They had worked together to temporarily fix the broken model airplane with tape from the customer service desk, a makeshift repair that would hold until proper glue could be found. David Williams, Andre's father, had arrived 45 minutes ago, a tall, broad-shouldered man with the same expressive eyes as his son and a military bearing that Malcolm recognized immediately. The reunion between father and son had been intensely emotional, David dropping to his knees to embrace Andre, his face contorting with anguish at the sight of his boy's swollen lip. Malcolm had stood back, giving them privacy while remaining nearby as promised. When David finally looked up to thank the man who had protected his son, the two veterans had recognized something in each other instantly, the unspoken brotherhood of those who had served. After a brief, powerful handshake, David had asked Malcolm for a private word. Andre told me what you did, David had said, his voice tight with emotion. Standing up when everyone else just watched. I don't know how to thank you. No thanks needed, Malcolm had replied simply. Just did what anyone should have done. But they didn't. You did. David had looked over at his son, who was showing Ms. Patel how the model airplane's wing was temporarily fixed. What's your final destination? Atlanta, same as you folks. Just passing through on my way to visit my sister in Savannah. David had nodded thoughtfully. Would you consider changing seats on the continuing flight? Sit with us. After what happened? He had left the sentence unfinished, but Malcolm understood. Now, as boarding for the rescheduled flight began, Malcolm stood when he saw David and Andre approaching the gate. Andre's face had brightened slightly at the sight of him, and Malcolm felt an unexpected tug of connection to this child he had known for only a few hours. They upgraded us to first class, David explained, holding up their new boarding passes. Said they had 3 seats together up front if you'd like to join us. Least they could do, apparently. Malcolm nodded his acceptance, shouldering his bag. How's the lip feeling, Andre? Andre touched his swollen lip gingerly. The ice helped. Dad says I might look like a boxer for a few days. A brave boxer, David added, resting his hand on his son's shoulder. As they boarded the plane, several passengers from the earlier flight nodded in recognition. Jasmine, who had volunteered to continue working the flight to Atlanta, greeted Andre with a warm smile. Our toughest passenger is back, she said cheerfully, bending down to his level. And we saved the best seats for you and your dad and Mr. Johnson. Once settled in the spacious first-class seats, Andre between Malcolm and his father, the reality of continuing the journey seemed to hit the boy anew. His small body tensed as other passengers filed past, his eyes darting nervously to each unfamiliar face. What if there's someone else like that man, he whispered to his father. David exchanged a glance with Malcolm over Andre's head. Then you have me and Mr. Johnson right here, he assured his son. But you know what? Most people aren't like that man. Most people are good. Your dad's right, Malcolm agreed. Remember all those people who stood up for you? Who gave you stuff and offered to help? They outnumbered the bad ones by a whole lot. Andre considered this, fidgeting with his seatbelt. I was scared, he admitted. I didn't do anything like you would have done, Dad. I just sat there. David's expression softened. Andre, look at me. He waited until his son met his eyes. Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared. That's what Mr. Malcolm said too, Andre noted, glancing at Malcolm. Smart man, David replied with a small smile. You know, when I was in Iraq, I was scared plenty of times. Andre's eyes widened in surprise. You were. But you're a soldier. Soldiers get scared too, son. Everyone does. But you know what scared me the most about today? David's voice grew thick with emotion. The thought of you being hurt and alone, thinking you had to handle it by yourself because that's what tough means. I didn't want you to think I was a baby, Andre confessed quietly. Being hurt doesn't make you a baby. Crying doesn't either. David put his arm around his son's narrow shoulders. When I got that call about what happened, you know what I did in the car on the way to Charlotte? What? I cried too. Because I love you, and someone hurt you, and I wasn't there to stop it. Andre leaned into his father's side, processing this revelation about the man he had always seen as fearless. The admission seemed to give him permission to acknowledge his own trauma. I keep seeing his face, Andre whispered. When he hit me. He looked like he hated me, but he doesn't even know me. Malcolm listened quietly, recognizing the confusion that came with experiencing racism's raw irrationality, something he had first confronted at around Andre's age. It was a cruel lesson that no child should have to learn, yet one that black parents had been helping their children navigate for generations. Some people carry so much anger inside them that it spills out onto anyone they can blame for their unhappiness, Malcolm finally said. It had nothing to do with you, Andre. Nothing at all. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration as the plane prepared for takeoff. Andre watched attentively, his natural curiosity briefly overcoming his anxiety. When the plane began taxiing, however, he gripped both armrests tightly. You know what helps me when I'm nervous about flying? Malcolm offered conversationally. What? Andre asked, grateful for the distraction. I think about the physics of it all. Do you know how many forces work together to keep a plane in the air? Andre shook his head. For the next several minutes, Malcolm explained lift, thrust, drag, and gravity in child-friendly terms, pointing out parts of the wing visible from their window. By the time the plane lifted off, Andre was focused on looking for the ailerons Malcolm had described rather than dwelling on his earlier trauma. As they reached cruising altitude, David turned to his son. You know, this whole situation got me thinking about something important, Andre. What's that? How much I don't tell you. David's expression was serious. About the world, about what it's like sometimes for people who look like us. I thought I was protecting you by not talking about it, but maybe I was just leaving you unprepared. Andre considered this, his young face thoughtful beyond his years. Mom tries to tell me stuff sometimes, but she says you don't like her scaring me with that kind of talk. David nodded, acknowledging the truth. Your mother was right. I was wrong. When we get home, things are going to be different. We're going to have some important talks. About racism? Andre asked, the adult word sounding strange in his childish voice. Yes. About that, and about what to do when you face it. Not just being quiet and taking it, but standing up for yourself in smart, safe ways. David looked at Malcolm. And about how there are always good people in the world too, people who will stand with you. The remainder of the flight passed uneventfully. Malcolm shared stories from his Air Force days, carefully edited for his young audience. David spoke about his own military service and his current work as an engineer. Andre gradually relaxed, occasionally asking insightful questions that made both men smile. As the Atlanta skyline came into view through the window, Andre turned to Malcolm with unexpected seriousness. "Mr. Malcolm? Thank you for fixing my airplane. And for, the other stuff." Malcolm nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken in the child's simple thanks. "You're welcome, Andre. Remember what I said about the most important weapon being the person next to you?" Andre nodded. "Well, sometimes that person isn't right next to you, but they're still out there. You just have to be brave enough to look for them." The plane descended toward Atlanta, carrying 3 passengers whose lives had been unexpectedly intertwined by one moment of cruelty and the defiance that followed: a decorated veteran, a father confronting difficult truths, and a child whose view of the world had been forever altered, for better and for worse. The Atlanta airport buzzed with its usual frenetic energy, travelers rushing to make connections, emotional reunions at arrival gates, the constant hum of announcements over the PA system. For Andre, his father, and Malcolm, the familiar chaos felt strangely muted after the intensity of the day's events. "Daddy, can Mr. Malcolm come home with us?" Andre asked as they waited for the jetway door to open. "He still needs to fix my airplane properly." David exchanged a look with Malcolm. "Mr. Johnson probably has his own plans, son." Malcolm checked his watch. "My connection to Savannah isn't for another 3 hours. I could spare some time." The doors opened, and as they stepped into the terminal, an unexpected scene awaited them. Just beyond the gate area stood 2 airline representatives in professional attire alongside 2 Atlanta police officers. Behind them, a small cluster of people with news cameras stood at a respectful distance, held back by airport security. "Mr. Williams?" One of the airline representatives stepped forward. "I'm Thomas Reynolds, Customer Relations Director for the airline's Atlanta operations. We've been briefed about the incident on your son's flight." David instinctively moved Andre behind him, his posture tensing. "What's going on here?" The representative held up reassuring hands. "Nothing to worry about, sir. We just wanted to meet you personally to express our deepest regrets about what happened and to inform you that we're conducting a full investigation. The company's CEO has been personally briefed." The second representative, a woman with a compassionate expression, knelt down to Andre's level. "Hello, Andre. I'm Vanessa from Customer Care. We have a special room prepared for you and your dad with some refreshments and privacy. We know it's been a difficult day." Malcolm began to step away, sensing this was a moment for the family, but Andre's hand shot out to grip his wrist. "Can Mr. Malcolm come too?" Vanessa smiled. "Of course he can." David noticed the news crews hovering at the perimeter. "And what about them?" Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Unfortunately, the incident has gained some attention on social media. Several passengers posted video clips during the diversion in Charlotte." One of the police officers stepped forward. "Mr. Williams, I'm Sergeant Barnes. We've been asked to escort you through the terminal to avoid any unwanted media interaction. We can take you through a staff corridor." As they were led away from the gate, Andre's grip on Malcolm's wrist remained firm. Behind them, several passengers from the flight were now being approached by reporters, some seemingly eager to share their accounts of what had happened. The private room they were escorted to was clearly designed for VIPs: plush seating, a refreshment bar, private restroom, and large windows overlooking the tarmac. Andre immediately gravitated to the window, watching the planes with the resilient curiosity of childhood, though his movements remained more subdued than they might have been 24 hours earlier. Thomas Reynolds cleared his throat. "Mr. Williams, on behalf of the airline, I want to assure you that we're taking this incident extremely seriously. The passenger in question has been permanently banned from our airline, and we're cooperating fully with authorities for potential criminal charges." David nodded stiffly. "And what about my son? What are you doing for him?" "We're prepared to offer comprehensive compensation, including medical expenses, counseling services if needed, and flight vouchers for future travel. Our legal department would like to meet with you at your convenience." Malcolm watched as David struggled to maintain his composure, clearly torn between righteous anger and the desire not to escalate emotions in front of his already traumatized son. "I appreciate that," David finally said, his voice measured. "But right now, my priority is getting my son home safely." "Of course." Vanessa gestured to a side door. "We have a car waiting whenever you're ready. It will take you directly to your vehicle or wherever you'd like to go." Andre had been quietly examining a model airplane display on one of the shelves. He turned at the mention of leaving. "Dad, can Mr. Malcolm come to our house? Just for a little while. To fix my plane." David looked to Malcolm, a silent question in his eyes. Malcolm understood, after such trauma, children often fixated on small, fixable problems when the larger ones felt overwhelming. The broken model represented something Andre could see repaired, unlike the invisible wounds of the day. "I can delay my connection to Savannah," Malcolm offered. "Family will understand." Relief washed over David's face. "We'd appreciate that. Actually, why don't you join us for dinner too? Least we can do." As they prepared to leave, David's phone rang. He checked the screen and excused himself to take the call in the corner of the room. From his serious expression and the way he lowered his voice, Malcolm guessed it might be Andre's mother. Andre moved closer to Malcolm, watching the planes outside. "Mr. Malcolm? Will the bad man go to jail?" The question caught Malcolm off guard with its directness. "I don't know, buddy. That depends on a lot of things. But he'll definitely face consequences for what he did." Andre nodded thoughtfully. In school, when Jake T. pushed Lily down at recess, he had to go to the principal's office and write an apology letter. Then his parents grounded him for a week. Adults face different kinds of consequences, Malcolm explained carefully. But the important thing is that what he did was wrong, and everyone knows it was wrong. "He hurt me because of my skin, didn't he?" Andre's voice was soft but surprisingly steady, his young mind cutting straight to the truth that adults so often tried to shield children from. Malcolm met the boy's eyes, recognizing the crucial moment for what it was. "Yes, Andre. He did. Why do some people hate us just because we're black?" Before Malcolm could formulate an answer to this impossible question, David returned, catching the tail end of his son's words. The phone call had left him looking drained, and Malcolm could see him gathering his strength to face this conversation he'd hoped to postpone a few more years. "That's going to take more than one talk, son," David said gently, crouching down to Andre's level. "But we're going to have those talks, starting today. Right now, though, let's focus on getting home. Your mom is really worried about you." Andre's expression brightened slightly. "You talked to Mom? Is she mad?" "Not at you," David assured him, with the ghost of a smile. "She's flying in tomorrow to see you." "But she has work," Andre said, clearly surprised by this information. "Some things are more important than work. You're more important." The airline representatives returned to escort them to the waiting car. As they moved through the private corridor, shielded from the public areas of the terminal, Andre reached for his father's hand. With his other hand, he maintained his grip on Malcolm's wrist, creating a physical chain linking the three of them together. Outside, Atlanta's late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pickup area. A black SUV with tinted windows waited at the curb, the driver standing ready to open the doors. "My car is in the south parking garage," David explained. "We'll take you directly there, sir," the driver assured him. As they prepared to enter the vehicle, a flash of movement caught Malcolm's attention. A news crew had somehow found their exit point and was approaching rapidly, a reporter leading the way with a microphone extended. "Mr. Williams. Can we get a statement about the incident on the flight? How is your son doing? Do you plan to sue the airline?" David's body tensed, his protective instincts surging. Before he could react, Malcolm smoothly stepped between the family and the approaching crew. "No comments at this time," Malcolm stated firmly, his military authority evident in his stance and tone. "This family deserves privacy." The security personnel quickly moved to intercept the news crew, but not before the reporter called out one more question. "Andre, how do you feel about what happened today?" To everyone's surprise, Andre stepped slightly forward, still holding his father's hand but facing the reporter with unexpected composure. "My airplane got broken," he said simply. "But Mr. Malcolm is helping me fix it." With that, he turned and climbed into the waiting SUV, leaving the adults to absorb the profound simplicity of his response, how children so often cut through complexity to the core truth that adults struggle to articulate. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, David caught Malcolm's eye, a mixture of pride and grief evident in his expression. No words were needed between them, both men understood the weight of the day's events and the long road that still lay ahead for Andre. The SUV merged into Atlanta's afternoon traffic, carrying them away from the airport where their paths had unexpectedly converged, 3 lives forever altered by one moment of hatred and the healing connections that had formed in its wake. 1 month later, the county courthouse stood imposing against the clear blue Georgia sky. Inside, the air conditioning hummed efficiently, creating an atmosphere of sterile calm that belied the emotional testimony taking place in courtroom 3B. Malcolm Johnson straightened his tie as he stepped down from the witness stand, having just completed his account of the events on the diverted flight. His testimony had been clear, factual, and damning, the measured words of a decorated veteran carrying undeniable weight with both judge and jury. As Malcolm returned to his seat in the gallery, he passed Richard Keller, who sat stiffly beside his attorney, his once immaculate appearance now diminished by the strain of the past month. The charges were serious: assault on a minor, with the hate crime enhancement that the prosecution had successfully argued for based on Richard's documented comments before and during the incident. In the month since the assault, Richard's life had unraveled with stunning speed. Parker Financial Group had terminated his employment within 48 hours of the video going viral. His membership at the exclusive Brookhaven Country Club had been placed under review, a euphemism for the quiet expulsion that followed. Former colleagues had distanced themselves with the self-preserving instinct of corporate America, unwilling to be associated with such toxic publicity. But most devastating to Richard was the defection of his legal team from the prestigious firm that had long represented Parker Financial's executives. They had withdrawn representation after viewing the unedited footage, leaving him with a court-appointed attorney who clearly found his client's case distasteful. Malcolm scanned the courtroom as he took his seat. 2 rows ahead sat Sophia Martinez, the teacher who had been sitting behind Andre on the flight. She had taken a personal day to testify, describing Richard's behavior with the precise observations of an educator trained to document concerning incidents. She turned briefly and caught Malcolm's eye, offering a small nod of solidarity. Across the aisle sat Jasmine, the flight attendant, in her airline uniform. She would testify next about the airline's protocols for unaccompanied minors and her observations of the incident. The airline had taken a surprisingly strong public stance, their actions clearly designed to position themselves on the right side of a story that had captured national attention. And in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, sat Andre with his parents. David's arm was draped protectively around his son's shoulders. Beside them was Michelle Williams, Andre's mother, who had flown in from Chicago the day after the incident and had extended her initially planned weekend visit into an indefinite stay. The past month had been a journey of processing trauma and finding resilience for the Williams family. Andre had started seeing a child psychologist specializing in racial trauma, his 3 times weekly sessions gradually decreasing to once a week as he showed signs of healing. There had been nightmares at first, fears of flying in crowds, but also moments of surprising strength. The judge called Jasmine to the stand. As she passed the Williams family, she gave Andre a reassuring smile. The boy had grown fond of the flight attendant who had shown him kindness throughout the ordeal. She had visited their home twice since the incident, bringing Andre a professional model aircraft kit that they had assembled together. Malcolm's thoughts drifted to his own visits to the Williams household over the past month. What had begun as a simple dinner to thank him had evolved into a genuine friendship. He had delayed his return to Savannah, calling his sister to explain the extraordinary circumstances. She had understood immediately, having followed the story on the news. That first evening at the Williams home, Malcolm had repaired Andre's model airplane with superglue and steady hands, just as he had promised. But the real repair work had been in the conversations that followed, David finally having those difficult discussions with his son about racism, resilience, and reality that he had previously avoided. Malcolm had found himself invited into these conversations, his own experiences offering Andre another perspective on navigating a world that sometimes judged him by his skin rather than his character. These talks had been painful but necessary, creating space for Andre to process what had happened to him while assuring him that one man's hatred did not define the world. The courthouse door opened quietly, and Malcolm turned to see several passengers from the flight entering the courtroom. The college student who had recorded the clearest video of the assault nodded in Malcolm's direction. The elderly woman, Margaret, who had spoken of her grandson's airplane collection, settled into a seat near the back. They had come to support Andre with their presence and testimony, the spontaneous community from the plane maintaining its connections weeks later. The proceedings continued with methodical precision. When Andre's turn came to testify, a hush fell over the courtroom. At the prosecutor's request, special accommodations had been made. Andre would testify via closed-circuit television from a separate room, sparing him the trauma of facing Richard directly. On the monitors throughout the courtroom, Andre appeared, sitting at a table with a court-appointed advocate beside him. He wore a blue button-down shirt and tie, his hair neatly trimmed. The swelling on his lip had long since healed, but the psychological wounds were still evident in his serious expression and the way his eyes darted nervously around the room off-camera. Malcolm felt his chest tighten as Andre was sworn in, the boy's small hand raised solemnly. The prosecutor approached with gentle questions, carefully worded to avoid re-traumatizing the child while establishing the facts needed for their case. Andre, can you tell us what happened on the airplane when your juice spilled? Andre took a deep breath, just as his therapist had practiced with him. The plane bumped. My juice spilled a little bit on the man's bag. I said sorry, but he got really mad. What happened next? He hit me. Andre's voice grew quieter. Right here. He touched his lip. It made me bleed and broke my airplane that my dad gave me. How did that make you feel? Andre looked down at his hands. Scared. And sad. And like I did something really bad, even though I didn't mean to spill. Did anyone help you after this happened? At this, Andre's expression brightened slightly. Mr. Malcolm stood up for me. And Ms. Jasmine helped my lip. And lots of people were nice to me after. The testimony continued for 15 more minutes, Andre answering questions with the straightforward honesty of childhood. When it concluded, the judge thanked him for his bravery, a rare departure from judicial neutrality that spoke volumes about the impact of the case. After Andre's testimony, the prosecution rested its case. The defense presented its arguments, claims of provocation, stress, and momentary loss of control that sounded hollow against the clear video evidence and consistent testimony from multiple witnesses. When the verdict came 3 days later, it surprised no one, guilty on all counts. The sentencing would follow in 2 weeks, but the prosecutors had already indicated they would seek significant penalties, including jail time, substantial fines, mandatory anger management and anti-racism training, and probation restrictions. Outside the courthouse, Andre stood between his parents as David made a brief statement to the assembled press. Today, justice was served not just for Andre, but for every child who has faced hatred because of the color of their skin. We're grateful to everyone who stood up that day on the plane, and to everyone who has supported us since. He looked down at his son. Andre has something he'd like to say. Andre stepped forward, his voice clear despite his nervousness. My dad and mom taught me that when bad things happen, you have to be brave. But being brave doesn't mean being alone. It means knowing when to ask for help and when to help others. I want to thank Mr. Malcolm and everyone who helped me. A week after the trial concluded, Malcolm received an invitation to speak at Andre's school. The principal had organized an assembly on upstanders versus bystanders, how to safely intervene when witnessing bullying or discrimination. Andre had suggested Malcolm as the perfect speaker. Standing before 300 elementary school students, Malcolm shared a simplified version of what had happened on the plane, emphasizing the community that had formed to support Andre rather than dwelling on the traumatic details of the assault. Being brave isn't about being the strongest or the loudest, Malcolm told the attentive young faces. It's about doing what's right, even when it's scary. Sometimes that means standing up when you see someone being treated unfairly. Sometimes it means asking for help when you need it. In the front row, Andre sat between his classmates, his expression serious but no longer haunted. When Malcolm finished speaking, Andre was the first to raise his hand. "Mr. Malcolm, do you think people can change? Like, can someone who does something mean learn to be better?" The question created a momentary silence in the auditorium, the profound nature of Andre's inquiry catching the adults off guard. Malcolm considered his answer carefully. "I believe they can, Andre. It's not easy, and not everyone chooses to change. But I've seen it happen. Sometimes it takes facing consequences. Sometimes it takes someone showing them a better way. But yes, I believe people can change." After the assembly, David, Michelle, and Malcolm watched as Andre rejoined his friends, the children's laughter echoing down the hallway as they headed to lunch. The sight of Andre smiling, genuinely smiling, was perhaps the most powerful evidence of his healing. "He's going to be okay," Michelle said softly, voicing what they were all thinking. "Better than okay," David replied. "He's going to be extraordinary." Malcolm nodded in agreement. The incident on the plane had revealed an inner strength in Andre that many adults never develop. His ability to process trauma, to seek healing, and to still question whether even those who had hurt him might change spoke to a depth of character that transcended his 8 years. Later that evening, at the Williams home, Andre showed Malcolm his new project, a detailed poster board display titled, "My Heroes," for his upcoming school assignment. The board featured pictures of his parents, his grandfather who had served in Vietnam, and, to Malcolm's surprise, a photograph of Malcolm himself that David had taken during one of his visits. "Teacher says heroes aren't just in movies," Andre explained seriously. "They're regular people who do the right thing even when it's hard." Malcolm felt a lump form in his throat as he studied the board. "Your teacher is very wise." "I'm not afraid to fly anymore," Andre announced suddenly, changing the subject with the natural fluidity of childhood. "Dad says we can visit Grandma in California this summer. That's a 5-hour flight." "That's excellent news," Malcolm replied, genuinely pleased at this sign of recovery. "You know what? I think you're going to be just fine, Andre Williams." Andre nodded with the solemn certainty of a child who has faced something frightening and survived. "Mom says sometimes bad things happen to teach us important stuff. I think I learned that there are more good people than bad ones." From the kitchen doorway, David and Michelle exchanged glances, their eyes communicating volumes about their son's journey, the trauma that no child should endure, but also the healing that had followed, fueled by love, professional support, and the unexpected community that had formed around them. The broken model airplane, now perfectly repaired, sat on a shelf in Andre's room, a small but powerful symbol of what had been damaged and made whole again. The scar was visible if you looked closely enough, but the plane was stronger at the break, reinforced with care and patience. Like Andre himself. This story teaches us that standing up against discrimination isn't just about grand gestures, it's about everyday courage when it matters most. Malcolm didn't hesitate when he saw injustice, showing that one person's actions can create a ripple effect of goodness. The spontaneous community that formed around Andre demonstrates how collective courage is stronger than individual hatred. For Andre, this traumatic experience became a painful but powerful lesson about the world, and about his own resilience. Through healing conversations with his parents and Malcolm, he learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that seeking help is its own form of strength. The story also highlights the profound impact adults have on children's understanding of difficult realities. By finally having honest conversations about racism, David helped his son process trauma in a way that fostered growth rather than fear. Meanwhile, Richard faced consequences for his actions, reminding us that accountability matters. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that when confronted with hatred, we always have a choice. We can remain silent bystanders, or we can become upstanders who help change the narrative. What would you have done if you had been on that flight? Would you have stood up like Malcolm or remained silent? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had spoken up? Or have you been an upstander in a difficult situation? Share your experiences and let's learn from each other. If this story touched you or made you think differently about stepping up when witnessing injustice, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, in a world where you can be anything, be an upstander. Thank you for joining me for this powerful story, and I'll see you in the next video.